Tonight we begin with a development that NATO officials had feared, dismissed, and ultimately failed to prepare for. A development that unfolded not over months, not over years, but in 72 hours. 72 hours that shattered decades of Western security assumptions. 72 hours that exposed fractures within the Atlantic Alliance so deep that some are now openly questioning whether NATO can survive what comes next. 72 hours that forced one man, Volodymyr Zelensky, to make decisions that his Western allies explicitly told him never to make. What Russia did this week crossed a line that the West had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, defiance, and a willingness to act alone that has left Brussels, Washington, and Moscow scrambling to understand what happens now. For 18 months now, there had been signals, not official briefings, not formal intelligence assessments, just signals that Russia was preparing something unprecedented. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been calculated in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain logic, a rhythm, almost a predictability. But what set off alarm bells in Western capitals this spring was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military communications know the indicators: the unusual movement of air defense systems toward the Baltic corridor, the repositioning of strategic assets from the Far East to the European theater, the sudden increase in encrypted traffic between Moscow and field commanders, the sudden disappearance of key officials from public view. All of that went quiet, and whenever Russia goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. The term Iron Curtain had been retired to history books, a relic of the Cold War, a metaphor that younger generations barely understood. But starting in early 2026, that metaphor became terrifyingly literal again. Russia began constructing what analysts are now calling the digital and physical exclusion zone, a multi-layered system designed to electronically blind NATO surveillance, jam communications across the Baltic, and create a corridor of uncertainty stretching from Kaliningrad to Belarus. This wasn't just military posturing, this was preparation. Early Thursday, NATO's Allied Air Command detected what they described as unprecedented electromagnetic activity along the alliance's eastern flank, including jamming capabilities that had not been deployed in any theater in over 40 years. These are the kinds of electronic warfare assets that Russia only activates when they are signaling something very specific, a major offensive, a territorial claim, or a direct challenge to NATO's Article 5 guarantee. Observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once, but what they did know was that Russia was changing its strategic posture, and when a nuclear-armed state shifts posture without explanation, even by small increments, every intelligence agency on the planet pays attention. The Iron Curtain 2, Zero, as it's being called, doesn't just block communications, it creates a zone of ambiguity, an area where NATO cannot see, cannot coordinate, and cannot respond with the speed that modern warfare demands. Within this zone, Russia could theoretically conduct operations that would take hours, perhaps days, for NATO to fully understand. By the time the alliance pieced together what was happening, the facts on the ground could be irreversible. That is the nightmare scenario that kept NATO planners awake for decades. And this week, that nightmare began materializing. The warning issued by NATO's Supreme Allied Commander tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after official emerging from emergency sessions described Russia's move as destabilizing, provocative, and perhaps most importantly, unprecedented in its timing and scope. Moscow clearly expected the West to respond the way it has for years, with statements, with sanctions, with measured escalation that ultimately changes nothing. But that strategy only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, Ukraine's response today was among the most aggressive military actions we've seen since the war began in 2022. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of Russia activating its Iron Curtain systems, Ukraine launched what military analysts are calling Operation Sovereign Thunder. These weren't the limited drone strikes we've seen before. These were coordinated deep strikes using weapons and tactics that Ukraine's Western allies had explicitly forbidden, targeting infrastructure that NATO had begged Kyiv to leave untouched. Zelensky broke the rules, every single one of them. Tonight, Ukrainian military sources confirmed that Kyiv launched precision strikes on Russian command nodes, including a facility in Voronezh Oblast that had recently been upgraded to serve as the primary coordination center for Russia's new electronic warfare network. Ukraine struck before Russia could fully activate its Iron Curtain. They hit the command facility. They hit the power substations feeding the jamming arrays. They hit logistics convoys that were transporting additional equipment to the Belarusian border. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's new strategy, the infrastructure that would have made the Iron Curtain operational. This is what made NATO's warning so urgent. Russia's Iron Curtain wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of strategic shift that could paralyze Western decision-making if left unchecked, and Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike civilian targets. They didn't cross into territory that would guarantee massive Russian retaliation. They hit the systems designed to blind NATO. They hit the infrastructure meant to isolate Ukraine from its allies, and they did so with weapons that Western capitals had specifically asked them not to use in this manner, including long-range missiles provided with explicit restrictions on targeting Russian territory. Zelensky broke those restrictions tonight, and the West is now facing a question it desperately tried to avoid. What happens when your ally stops following your rules? And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence analysts now believe that Russia's Iron Curtain activation was designed to test the cohesion of NATO after months of political instability across the alliance. Russia wanted to see whether NATO would fracture under pressure. They wanted to see whether member states would retreat into national interests. They wanted to see whether Ukraine, isolated and increasingly desperate, would finally accept territorial concessions. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't retreat. Ukraine launched a response that was so swift, so precise, that even Moscow noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But today, Kyiv did. Defense analysts speaking with international media under anonymity described Russia's Iron Curtain as a pressure multiplier, a way to force NATO into paralysis while Moscow pursues objectives it couldn't achieve through conventional warfare alone. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and willing to act independently. Their strikes were not only effective, they were timed so precisely that Russian air defenses had barely activated before the first missiles found their targets. That timing matters because it shows Ukraine has intelligence capabilities that exceed what Russia anticipated. It shows that Ukraine is not waiting for permission, they are acting. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian special forces carried out sabotage operations inside Russian-controlled territory, forcing the evacuation of at least 2 command posts. Ukrainian drones targeted fuel depots that had been stockpiled in the last 72 hours in preparation for extended electronic warfare operations. Ukrainian cyber units operating in coordination with unknown partners reportedly disabled communication nodes used by Russian forces to coordinate the Iron Curtain activation sequence. This wasn't just retaliation, this wasn't just defense, this was preemption, this was strategic initiative. And strategic initiative is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the initial invasion failed to capture Kyiv. For every advance Moscow has made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates Russian planning, disrupts Russian logistics, and demonstrates that this war will not end on Moscow's terms. Remember, Russia thought Ukraine would collapse within weeks in 2022. They thought NATO would fracture under energy pressure. They thought sanctions would prove temporary and manageable. They thought the West would eventually grow tired and force Kyiv to negotiate from weakness. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is striking deeper than ever before. NATO, despite its fractures, is being forced to confront its own relevance, and Russia's new Iron Curtain, the strategy designed to give Moscow escalation dominance, is facing countermeasures before it even became fully operational. Putin's gamble was that the West had lost the will to resist. Tonight, Ukraine is proving that assumption catastrophically wrong. What makes this moment so consequential and so dangerous is that Russia's Iron Curtain activation happened at a time when Putin is under extraordinary domestic and international pressure. Hardliners within Russia want total victory and complete annexation of Ukrainian territory. Pragmatists want a negotiated settlement that secures territorial gains without further economic damage. Military leaders want the resources to rebuild forces depleted by years of attritional warfare. And the Russian public, increasingly aware of the war's true costs, wants an end that justifies the sacrifices. Putin is balancing these demands while facing a Ukrainian adversary that refuses to behave predictably. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure, they're doing it from vulnerability. The Iron Curtain wasn't a sign of Russian confidence. It was a sign of Russian desperation, an attempt to change the strategic equation before internal pressures become unmanageable. NATO's emergency statement, now distributed to all member governments, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to accept a new Iron Curtain dividing Europe. Officials said plainly that Russia's electronic warfare activation was inconsistent with the principles of European security and stability. That is diplomatic language for this is an act of strategic aggression and there will be consequences. You don't usually hear that tone from NATO unless something serious is at stake. But what's notable is what NATO didn't say. They didn't condemn Ukraine's strikes. They didn't demand Kyiv stand down. They didn't publicly distance themselves from Zelensky's decision to break the rules. That silence speaks volumes. It suggests that behind closed doors, at least some NATO members recognize that Ukraine did what the alliance itself was too divided to do: act decisively while there was still time. Meanwhile, Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a defiant, unapologetic speech tonight. He said, "We did not ask permission to defend ourselves. We never will." He said, "Our allies drew lines on maps and told us not to cross them. But those lines did not protect our cities. They did not protect our children. They did not protect our future." And he said, "Tonight, Ukraine reminded the world that we are not a buffer zone. We are not a negotiating chip. We are a nation that will fight for its existence with whatever means we possess." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime president who understands just how high the stakes have become and who has clearly decided that waiting for Western consensus is no longer an option. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's Iron Curtain activation wasn't isolated. Along with the electronic warfare deployment, Belarus also conducted unusual military exercises near the Polish border, forcing NATO to scramble additional defensive assets. Russian naval forces in the Baltic increased activity near Swedish territorial waters, waters that Sweden, as a new NATO member, is obligated to defend. Russian propaganda channels increased disinformation operations targeting NATO populations, amplifying narratives about alliance disunity and Western decline. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. This was not a single provocation. This was a coordinated campaign. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing for a major offensive in the coming weeks, using the Iron Curtain to blind NATO surveillance and create operational surprise. Another is that Russia is attempting to force negotiations by demonstrating that it can raise the stakes indefinitely, hoping that Western fatigue will finally translate into pressure on Kyiv to accept territorial concessions. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to establish a permanent electronic barrier that would effectively end NATO's ability to support Ukraine through intelligence sharing and coordination. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for NATO to deliberate. They didn't wait for the UN Security Council to issue statements. They didn't wait for Washington to approve additional weapons packages. They struck the Iron Curtain's infrastructure while it was still being assembled. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see whether NATO can survive internal divisions long enough to remain relevant. Ukraine wants to show that it can act independently when its survival is at stake. The United States wants to prevent this conflict from escalating into a direct confrontation with Moscow, and Europe wants to prevent a new Iron Curtain from dividing the continent for another generation. These objectives are not entirely compatible, and that incompatibility is what makes the next few weeks so dangerous. Tonight, we've heard from NATO officials who are now monitoring Russian communications for signs of retaliation. They say Russian forces have gone into defensive postures across several sectors. They say Moscow's initial response has been more muted than expected, possibly indicating that Ukraine's strikes caused more disruption than publicly acknowledged. And they say Russia's decision to activate the Iron Curtain is likely part of a broader strategy intended to fracture Western unity before any potential ceasefire negotiations. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is doubling down. Their response today, precise, defiant, and unilateral, sent a message to Russia that Kyiv will not be isolated quietly, and it sent a message to NATO that Ukraine is prepared to act alone if the alliance cannot find its voice. As the weekend continues, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with its Iron Curtain strategy. But what we do know is that Ukraine's preemptive response was timely. It disrupted Russian planning before the electronic warfare network could reach full operational capability. It demonstrated capabilities that Moscow had clearly underestimated. And it forced a conversation within NATO about whether the alliance's cautious approach is helping Ukraine or slowly strangling it. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the coming days. If they escalate further, Ukraine has already shown it will respond in kind. If they pause to reassess, NATO will face uncomfortable questions about whether Zelensky's rule-breaking actually worked. Either way, the alliance will never look at this conflict the same way again. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be genuinely uncertain. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Russia is quiet after a setback, it means they are recalculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Russia learned something they should have understood years ago. Ukraine will not wait for permission to survive. Ukraine will not follow rules that lead to its destruction. And Ukraine will strike first if striking first is the only path to survival. The story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The Iron Curtain that was supposed to divide Europe may have just accelerated NATO's reckoning with its own relevance. Zelensky's decision to break the rules may have saved Ukraine, or it may have started a chain of events no one can control. And the world is watching, breath held, as two visions of European security collide in ways that will shape the next century. We will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.